This episode is brought to you by San Pellegrino Ciao, a new kind of flavored sparkling water. The kind made with real fruit juice, a pinch of Sicilian salt, and the sparkle of the Italian sun. With no added sugar and just 10 or less calories per can, enjoy. With love, from Italy. By San Pellegrino Ciao now.
Amazon Pharmacy presents Painful Thoughts.
I read somewhere that the average American spends 13 hours a year waiting in pharmacies for prescriptions. Clearly, I am above average. I thought being above average would feel better. Maybe I'll read some greeting cards.
Next time, use Amazon Pharmacy. We deliver. And here's to being anything but average. Amazon Pharmacy. Healthcare just got less painful.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined on this special 4th of July episode by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, happy Independence Day.
Oh, happy! They've been happier, but happy Independence Day to you.
Well, it's funny, as we're recording this, we are in fact recording this on July 4th, the 249th anniversary of American independence. And you're talking about the political clouds that may be weighing over us at the moment, Ken. But I am facing the window, and we are having literal rain pour down here in Oklahoma City as we do this. So it's both metaphorical and true. As we talk about the 4th of July. So we were going to start just for a few minutes because we are doing something a little different. We're recording on the 4th because Ken and I are crazy, I guess. I don't know. No, we just love freedom is what it is. But it's true. We are the most freedom loving, I think, we disagree a little bit about how we get there, but we're the most freedom loving. We're not like these moderates.
Yeah, I'll take that. I agree with that.
But what we thought we'd start with is just thinking a little bit about the 4th of July and, American independence and what that means. And a lot of listeners, they actually advocated that we ought to read the entirety of the Declaration of Independence. And so I'm just here to tell you that we are not going to do that. Keep listening right there. But I will read the piece that I, in fact, read to my students in my American politics class each year. And then we'll just kind of go from there. And it says this is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitles them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient suffering of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former system of government. And so, Ken, they're always, I'll tell you, I'll be honest, I always get little goosebumps when I read this every year, and I still get little bits. It is amazing language, right? It's phenomenal language. And I think a lot of people don't realize, this is Jefferson at his best, channeling social contract theorists specifically. I mean, some of these pieces, today we would cite him for plagiarism almost here, things like the consent of the government and life, liberty, and what Locke would have called property, but what he makes it more liberal, right? He's expanding on Locke and saying it's not just the property, it's your pursuit of happiness. He's even more liberal than Locke, which is a pretty liberal dude for the era. And so I think sometimes we forget how liberal, and I mean that in the kind of more broad sense, our founding really was. Of course, with the exception, and this is the one we've talked about it on the show earlier, there is this inherent contradiction that you can't walk away from, right? All men are created equal, except for a few of us who aren't really men. And, that will lead to individuals like, what is the 4th of July to a slave? Very specifically saying, yeah, I can't celebrate your 4th of July. And so there's this both goosebumpy and amazing liberalism of this document, and at the same time, this kind of inherent behind it sadness that lurks. And I think those things in tension as we move towards trying to live up to it in ways we haven't always lived up to has kind of been the American ideal, even if we've failed sometimes at that. What for the 4th, what is it for you, Ken?
Well, I do love the Declaration. I got to agree with you on that. I've been focusing a little bit more. I know you quit after the preamble, but I've been looking at the Intolerable Acts as well, which are what come next in the Declaration, right after the preamble, right after where you stopped reading. There's a long list of intolerable things that King George III has done, which make it necessary for us to declare independence from England. And some of those, I'm not going to read all of them because it's a very long list. But some of those seem very on point for today's situation, really. Particularly, one of the Intolerable Acts is that King George has endeavored to prevent the population of these states by obstructing the laws for the naturalization of foreigners, right? That he has stopped us from letting foreigners get naturalized here, and that's stopped us from allowing our economy and our population to grow. And he's refused to pass other laws to encourage their migrations hither. In other words, it's intolerable that he's not letting them come. It's also it's intolerable even that he's not encouraging them to come, and that he's raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. So the kind of anti-immigration focus of King George III was one of the Intolerable Acts. Another of the Intolerable Acts is he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. That looks a lot like what's been happening in Los Angeles, California the last couple of weeks, I think, sending swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Well, again, he's sent the military into California against the wishes of the California governor, and he has sent the military
as of today. 400 Marines.
Oh, Florida! I didn't know that.
As of today, yes.
Yeah, that I don't know. That might be with the request of DeSantis. I'm not sure.
I'll be honest. It just happened as we were, putting the show together, but it was not clear if that had happened that way or not. So that's an excellent point. But I'm not. It wasn't clear.
Yeah, so if it wasn't with the request of the governor, as it certainly wasn't in California, then I would say that is rendering the military independent of and superior to the civil power. And actually, I'd say the same about the bombing in Iran. It violated the War Powers Resolution. Congress did not authorize it, so I would call that another. Even though I think that may have been broadly popular in the country here, it was rendering the military independent of and superior to the civil power, in my view. And then the final one I'll just mention is for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. That's another of the Intolerable Acts.
That was the one I thought you were going to bring up. Yeah, because that's the one I was thinking about myself.
Yeah, that's the one I want to end with there. But I mean, there are a lot more. But I think some of the intolerable acts that are mentioned in the Declaration as being so intolerable that we can't keep a government that does this stuff to us. I think there's it's worth contemplating a minute. How that plays out today.
And it's funny because one of the things, and this has been happening for years, and I've noticed and paid attention to this because obviously when I was a graduate student, I was paying very close attention to then Twitter for the things I was doing for my dissertation. But every year it is funny. There's a number of institutes and institutions that X out or tweet out. I don't know what you call it anymore. They tweet out the Declaration of Independence piece at a time, and inevitably every year, depending on who's the president, you have this big swarm of individuals who go, "How dare you say this thing about fill in the blank," which is always a little bit hilarious to me in ways because it kind of indicates the extent to which we've really accepted broad presidential powers, that everybody's so on edge that they can take pieces of the intolerable things that King George did and go, "How dare you say that about fill in the blank president?" But at the same time, you're not wrong that we probably have in many ways overstepped the things that we once would have called intolerable, and I think that there is a lot of truth to that. But maybe we ought not today exactly take up arms and start shooting anybody, Ken. But
I do feel like not that there'd have to be a violent revolution, but I do feel like if things keep going on this trajectory, we might see a little bit more of a rerun of 1861 rather than 1776. We might see some states demanding secession. And I don't know if there'd be another war over that. In more modern contexts, in places like Quebec or Scotland, where they did take votes. Fortunately, I think none of those votes carried. But I don't think there would have been wars to prevent the secessions of Quebec or Scotland if that had actually happened. There was not a war to prevent Great Britain from seceding from the European Union. So I think secession might possibly be able to proceed in the 21st century.
It could, or you could see something like
war.
You could also see something like the Catalonia effect, right? Where Catalonia declare, they have a vote, they're going to be independent, but instead of having a conflict, effectively Spain ends and arrests just quickly and summarily the individuals who are running the Catalonian government and replace them quickly with you could potentially, I could see that as being another contemporary example of how that would go, as opposed to a civil war, though, right? Where you would just have, this is easy. We're going to quickly send in some Marines and we're going to take out you're not the governor of Florida or, fill in the blank anymore, and done. We're moving forward. California, we're going to move, moving forward. You got to have a new election for your state house. But that is an interesting point. But
because if we had I'll just say, if we had a blue state secession now, it's not necessarily the case that the red states would oppose it. So they might not see any reason to.
That's true, too. In other words, you wouldn't have the Spanish impetus to want to hold it together, potentially. In other words, it would be more Brexitist, and it is almost mutual. Not exactly mutual, but more-ish mutual.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Well, and that kind of leads, there's this apocryphal moment. It doesn't take place even apocryphally during the 4th of July, but it fits here. But after the passage of the Constitution, there's this little apocryphal story that as Benjamin Franklin is leaving, that a lady asks him, what did you guys do? And he says, well, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And I think that is one of the things that is inspiring about the American experiment. 249 years is a weird thing to call an experiment. And yet it is, because it requires us each generation to continue to understand it, to attest to it, to move it forward. And that's something else that makes us so amazing. I'm gonna take a normative stand here, because what makes being an American, I'm gonna get really political for a minute. It's not the fact that you speak English. It's not your particular ethnicity. It's not any of those things, it's attesting to wanting to be a part of a particular kind of political system. And there's really, if you look around the world, that's one of the things that honestly makes the United States so unique from other countries. You can live in Japan or China forever and a day, and you're never going to be Japanese or Chinese, right? Like it is by its very nature impossible. But you can become American, right? At its best ideal, you can become an American. You can continue that process forward. And I think that's one of the things that makes us so inspiring. And I think for me, I know this is not a popular position, but I think that's one of the reasons I'm such a pro-immigration kind of guy, because that's part of what makes us so cool, right? I don't have to be a particular religion. I can just attest to these political ideals. I want to be a part of these political ideals. And now, okay, boom, you're an American. And yeah, so
I'm with you 100% on all that.
We always agree too much, Ken. So, well, I guess on that, I hope maybe an inspiring note, maybe we start getting into the politics of the week, right? So we're going to do something a little bit differently today in that Ken and we're going to start with, again, it's weird for me to say this is the name of the bill, but it actually is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. But it's so big that we're really going to kind of split it into two things here. We're going to talk about the politics of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and then we're going to talk about and get into the details of the policies of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. As a matter of fact, I was doing so much reading over the last couple of days, I was starting to go cross-eyed yesterday, and that's why we split this. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going cross-eyed. We really need to think about, how can we get into this in a really approachable way. So we're going to start with the politics, and I don't think anybody's going to be shocked about this, but just yesterday, Thursday, Republicans passed that One Big Beautiful Bill Act that had been sent to them from the Senate with only 2 defectors. That means it passed by a 218 to 214 vote. And to really get into all of it, again, we're going to break it up into those segments. But let me just give the broad strokes, just the thumbnails of the policies so we can talk about those politics. But in those kind of broad ways, it's going to do 5-ish. And I say ish very hesitantly here because, again, this is a thumbnail. It extends the tax cuts from Trump's first term and implements some new tax cuts, such as eliminating income on taxes and on tips and overtime wages. It also increases spending dramatically on immigration enforcement in a variety of different ways. It also increases spending on defense, and it also raises the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. And then additionally has some cuts to things both included in Medicaid and in the ACA. And again, I recognize that as a thumbnail. We're going to get into those details in a moment. But let's start here with the political analysis. I think one thing that I want to say, Ken, is that this, I've been saying it for a while. I don't think it should be controversial anymore. This marks, as a kind of a historian, political science juncture, the Republican Party in the era of Trump is no longer the party of deficits or conservative economic policy. Now, I have been saying that since 2016, but I think we're finally all on. I don't think you can make the case that isn't what's going on anymore. Just politically speaking, that's the end. And that, I'm not taking a shot right now about it. I'm just trying to speak empirically. But this is, I think the One Big Beautiful Bill is going to mark a watershed moment for Republicans and close observers. And so while there is an attempt to decide how much it is going to cost the deficit, there's a lot of debates over which of these scorings ought we to use. And let's be honest, the CBO's scoring is just fine. But even if we want to go to like a more conservative outlet, I went over to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget Project. Just to be clear, that is a very Republican, more Republican, even more conservative kind of project. And even they, using their own metrics, are arguing that the bill will add $2.4 trillion to the deficit over the coming decade. And so again, that's a little bit lower than the CBO number, but $2.4 trillion is not nothing. So what's the upside, politically speaking? Why are Republicans for voting for this bill? I think from Democrats' point of view, the rhetoric is basically, look, rich people win. And there's some truth to that. I'm not trying to walk that back, but I do think that is a little too simplistic. And I think it will, in fact, hurt Democrats politically if that's where they just sit on it, because I think the clear politics for Republicans today is immigration. That is where everybody's hanging their hat politically. That's why Republicans think they can still win in the midterms. It has nothing to do with the deficit. That's dead. The idea that we care about those kind of things is done. The central piece here, I think, politically, is the immigration piece. And I think this, and I'm curious about your take on this, Ken, because I think this is what the left is failing to see. Restricting immigration, deporting people, building these facilities. It has not been this popular forever. As a matter of fact, I wanted to make sure we're empirical about this. I went to Gallup and looked at it right now. As of right now, 55, we're not talking about any particular party. This is the country as a whole, representative samples. 55% of people think that immigration needs to be decreased. 40% of people think this is the biggest or the top issue facing the country. That outpaces by huge magnitudes things like healthcare. As a matter of fact, an unreported finding, I was digging through this because I was kind of really curious about this. The number of people who report that in other words, more than zero, any immigration is bad, sits at 32% of the country. You can head to the News Gallup polls if you want to take a look at some of those details for listeners. And I think that's really what Republicans are saying. They're saying deficits don't matter. The fact that we have an unbalanced kind of tax cut happening here doesn't matter, because the winning piece of this is immigration enforcement. And I think that's the politics of it. As a matter of fact, I'm here in Representative Bice's district, and I always get all the texts from everybody because I'm curious about the ways that they bring things forward. And that is precisely the way I was actually writing up the stuff from Gallup when I got the text from Bice going, breaking news, we just passed this. And what is the number one thing in the text? It is going to unleash a bill to secure the border. That's how she's, framing this. And I think that's important. And I don't think it takes but 2 seconds to see that the people who may or may not be harmed on the healthcare side of things, because we're still trying to kind of figure that out. I'm not saying people won't be harmed. I'm trying to figure out the specific ones. I don't think that. I think Republicans are looking at immigration, and I think Democrats are going to end up not recognizing the flank they're getting from Trump. There you go. What are your thoughts about this, Ken, on the politics side, kind of like, that era to start with?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've talked about that, the immigration being the third rail of contemporary politics before. And, sadly, I have to agree with your diagnosis. I wish it were otherwise. But, immigration seems to be the issue that Trump is basically able to maintain. Even though he is underwater in public opinion, he'd probably be much more underwater without that one issue, because that's the one where his supporters feel the most strongly. It's a challenge for Democrats. I think, I do think that the Republicans are overplaying their cards on internal immigration enforcement, on sending big militarized presences into cities, or now going back and forth on whether they're going to do raids on farms and things like that. I think they're overplaying their cards there, and that there may be some openings there for there to be a backlash. But I have to agree with you that in terms of at the border itself, it seems like a substantial majority of the American public wants to see a closed border. And I think it's going to be hard for Democrats to push back on that. Like, I think Democrats basically can't really make the border into an issue they want to emphasize coming into the elections. But I think they can make the internal enforcement overreach, the lack of due process, the military presence in the cities. I think that's much more the kind of thing where public opinion, could go the other way. And in fact, I think it already has. I think a lot of the polls are showing that public opinion is against military occupations of American cities, or against deporting people without any kind of due process at all. I think the Abrego Garcia case, was not a winner for the Trump administration, especially after the Supreme Court ruled that he had to come back, and they must have even thought that, because after all, they did bring him back, and I think the reason they brought Abrego Garcia back had to be because of public opinion, more than because of court decisions, which they otherwise seem somewhat inclined to ignore sometimes. So I think I do, but yeah, immigration is something that Dems have to be careful about how they think about. I'm also kind of dismayed that one thing I think that the bill will get away with in terms of the politics of it is all these really draconian cuts to Medicaid, to SNAP, to spending that takes place in red states. A lot of that just simply gets delayed by until after the midterm elections, so it doesn't kick in right away. And I do think his voters are stupid enough, not to get that, right? So that this bill has passed. They're hearing this rhetoric that all these people are getting kicked off Medicaid. Nobody's getting kicked off Medicaid, until a year from now. But they won't. They'll just say, yeah, see, nobody got kicked off Medicaid. This was all a hype. This was all a hoax. So I think that's actually going to work, and it's a very cheap trick, but I think he'll get away with it.
Well, there's actually two things about what you say there to bring a little bit of the social science into bearing. There is this idea, you say, for instance, they're stupid enough. I wouldn't necessarily say they're stupid. I think there's a guy named Fiorina and others, and what they discover is that voters are never making policy voting choices. So in other words, predicting the future is difficult at best. Voters don't attempt to predict the future in those ways when they're making voting decisions. Instead, they look back, and he calls it retrospective voting. It's the retrospective voting model. And so they don't even have to remember precisely what it is that happened, going all the way back, but they kind of end up with this series of check marks and X's for each party for how they felt and how the policies affected them in the past. And so in this kind of case, voters, the fact that this will affect them in the future, it's not going to not affect people's voting because they're dumb. It's not going to affect their voting because it's not the way people vote. People vote in the looking backwards. And so until the thing in fact impacts them, it will not become part of the calculus for which they're voting. And so in that sense, that can be, I think, is really difficult right now, especially for those of us who we're looking forward, right? We're lawyers and social scientists and we're political scientists, and we're looking at this and we're saying, here's what's going to happen. And you kind of want to pull the general voting population along and say, look at this and see what will happen if. And the answer is that voters, they don't do it that way, right? We scientifically, empirically know it's not. They will never vote that way. You can drag them all to the water, but no one's going to drink that way, right?
Well, I mean, I agree with that. I do think it's fair to call them stupid, though. I mean, the reason that they don't vote that way is because they're stupid. Because if these people were all,
you are never going to run for office. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, but a whole bunch of Trump voters, if they were kicked off of Medicaid today, if they were kicked off of SNAP today, if their job disappeared because, they're working on a wind farm in Indiana or something, and then it doesn't get its subsidy anymore today, that would be a voting issue for them this November, right? Because it would have already happened. It would be a voting issue for them. So just the fact that he's put it into, he's put into motion a process where there's absolute certainty that is going to happen, but it's just going to be delayed by a year and a couple of months. I think for people to not see that and so that their vote comes out different just because of that trick, I don't know why we wouldn't call them stupid.
Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of like saying that, it's a good question, and students ask me that one too all the time, and I think my answer long has been, it's kind of like calling a rabbit stupid for not flying. I mean, would it be advantageous for the rabbit to fly away? Absolutely, but we know empirically that that's not how a rabbit works, and I think the same thing holds true for voters. We might want them to fly, but the way we are psychologically built is we don't do it that way. So, I mean, in a democratic country, there is zero evidence that anyone anywhere ever looks forward. And so for me, that doesn't feel like stupid so much as it feels like the rabbit that won't fly. So I hear what you're getting at, because it's frustrating, and I'm there.
Yeah.
But
I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true about all blocks of voters. For instance, you and I both work in higher ed. There've been certain universities that have been immediately targeted and had, federal funds that have already been appropriated to them not come through. And then there's like a lot of other universities where that hasn't happened to that great of extent yet. But they all can see it, right? They're not stupid the way these other, red state voters are stupid, right? Everybody in universities can see, if we haven't immediately had our funding retroactively cut, still we're having it cut. It's being cut. That's happening to us. Nobody's missing that. So I do think
that is true, but I guess you got to be careful, though. That isn't a voting behavior anymore, because you're talking about an individualized, specialized group, and voters don't tend to be that. And then, two, also, one must be cautious. Individuals who are at universities, we are in fact trained to. What makes us unique is we spend a huge portion of our life trying to undo some of our natural human tendencies, and because otherwise everybody would be a scientist, right? Like if it just came naturally, we would all be a social scientist or a physician, or fill in the blank. So I hear what you're saying. I mean, I get it, but again, remember, the population of people you're talking about are spending I have spent a huge swath of my life attempting to overcome and find ways to systematically figure out what my own biases as a human being is, so that I can be more of a science and less of a intuitive human, right? And so I don't disagree with what you're saying there. I guess what I disagree with is I'm not sure that I could take that and say, aha, my sister-in-law is going to become a social scientist so that she'll be able to vote prospectively. Is that fair? What do you think? I mean, it's an honest question.
I think that it's not just university people. I think almost all of the different sectors of our society that are run by people that have to do more planning. So like even Elon Musk, right? Let's take Elon Musk. He's kind of, not a university person, right? He's a business mogul, but he, the fact that, all the tax credits for the electric cars are being zeroed out. He can see what that means, right? Now that hasn't happened yet, right? You could still go today and buy an electric car and get one of those tax credits, but they're being zeroed out, by the bill.
Yeah, by October.
Yeah. And so he can see what, he's not under any illusion. Oh, well, nothing's happened yet. I guess nothing's going to happen, because the bill, says it's going to happen. And so he's, essentially, he goes back and forth on it, but he's essentially turned against Trump on some of this stuff. And so I just think there's people who are able to, look a few steps in front of their own face can see, where if the bill already says this is going to happen and it starts on day X, there's really no doubt that it's going to happen, but I think for all the people who are going to get cut off Medicaid and SNAP, it's not like that's something that might happen. That's something that will happen on a date certain, but it's just that they're not seeing it yet.
No, I hear that. Now, I think the other thing, to pivot to another political takeaway, there's always this kind of, we have often asked ourselves, okay, to what extent is Trump the leader of the Republican Party? Is he still, is he not, will he continue to be? And I think the other thing that this cements is that Donald Trump is, again, I don't often say that I'm right about a lot of stuff. I usually say like, well, Ken was right 6 months ago, but this time I'm going to give myself credit and say I was the same person that, no, Trump is not on his way out of being in control of the Republican Party. And you bring up Musk, which is a great one, right? I mean, Musk spent somewhere in the vicinity of $300 billion, had his own independent social media following. And where is he now in the politics of things? And the answer is completely and utterly out, with his company down 7% just yesterday because he once again went up against Donald Trump and the MAGA circle. And or take a look at Senator Hawley of Missouri, who made all kind of arguments that he wasn't going to vote for this sucker, and where did he vote? And same went for both the Freedom Caucus members. We got we'll point out obviously Massey of Kentucky, was the one holdout on that front. But we know what's coming on that front. He is going to get primaried. Trump is going to back that primary, and if there is any indication, that means he's probably out of a job, I think, come the midterms at the primary level. And so no, I think the other political thing is this is the era of the Trump party. And I don't think that any Republican any Republican who denies that is there. I'm with you, is willfully lying or ignorant. I don't know.
Yeah.
Put us in a box. Go ahead. That just gives us something to break out of. Because the next generation 2025 GMC Terrain Elevation is raising the standard of what comes standard. As far as expectations go, why meet them when you can shatter them? What we choose to challenge, we challenge completely. We are professional grade. Visit gmc.com to learn more.
At Strayer University, we help students like you go from, is it possible, to anything is possible, by offering access to up to 10 no-cost gen ed courses, so you can reach your goals affordably and fast. Visit strayer.edu to learn more. No-cost gen ed's provided by Strayer University affiliate Sophia. Eligibility rules apply. Connect with us for details. Strayer University is certified to operate in Virginia by Chev and has many campuses, including at 2121 15th Street North in Arlington, Virginia.
Well, I mostly agree with that. The one thing I might disagree, I don't think Trump's going to succeed in pushing Massey out. I do think that Musk is going to underwrite Massey's campaign so that there'll be an opportunity, for Massey to match, dollar for dollar, whatever Trump's going to bring against him. And
did you really think Elon is going to go toe to toe in Kentucky? That's a big prediction.
He said he would, and he even said that Massey, Elon. I mean, I don't think this will happen, but Elon's even talking about starting some new third party. And Massey, in his well,
it's supposed to happen today. The day after they voted on it, here we are. So.
Yeah. So I don't know where that's really going, but he was talking about Massey as being part of that. The other reason I don't think Trump will be able to get Massey out so easily is Trump doesn't 100% of the time succeed. He succeeds about 80 or 90% of the time. But we can think of cases like Raffensperger and Kemp in Georgia, where Trump wanted them out and they didn't get them out. And I do think Massey has a pretty good relationship with his district. And in fact, the state of Kentucky, weirdly, because it's paradoxical, and I know it's you were born and raised there, right? But
absolutely,
it's both like one of the largest recipients of federal transfer payments in the country, but also one of the most libertarian ideologically states in the country, which is a paradox to me, right? It really lives on big government, but people there hate big government, and someone like Rand
Paul, so the listeners know that is in large part due to if you take a look at the geography and where people live, the explanation for that becomes a little more clear, but you're not wrong. It is a paradox. Continue, my friend.
Yeah. And so it wasn't just Massey. It was also Senator Rand Paul who voted against this bill as well. And that libertarian brand in Kentucky is strong. Massey is pretty well loved in his district. And I do think Trump is going to have a hard time dislodging him.
Now, I'm with you. I don't think he can get rid of, and that's the same reason I don't think he put up a lot of fight with Rand. I mean, they had a little bit of an exchange, but no, the Massey. Now, if your prediction is correct, and Elon does in fact back Massey, that would change my calculus, and I agree with you on that. But that I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I think without the dollars from Elon, or other words, some kind of dollars that can go toe to toe with that, I do think Massey is more vulnerable than Rand. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, we'll see.
So here we go. We're sort of disagreeing about something. Yeah. We'll have a slightly different prediction. Well, we talked a lot about the politics, but there's obviously the policies, and we need to get into that as well, because and I'm just going to be honest, I read. It is too soon to be able to really answer every question we might have about the one big beautiful bill. But I think there are some major policies that are obvious that we can take a look at and we can talk about. And I talked about this on Discord as well. This is going to be harder for me to be the detached, scholarly person that I attempt to do on this show, right? And that is because of the healthcare aspect of this bill, right? So I'm just being honest about that. So if you think I'm being a little harsher on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, my apologies. I have some deep normative issues with it. And I'm just saying that at the outset, just so that we're all on the same page. But at the same time, I mean, there are not this bill is huge. Everything in this bill is not necessarily terrible, right? We've talked a little bit about this. So for example, let's go through some of the policies and we can get into those details. The tax cuts on its face are not necessarily bad things. They are unfortunately, higher rates for the higher earners at a rate that exceeds. But for the individuals making in that 9.5 to 38,000 range, there is going to be a 3% tax cut going there. As you get to the 38 to 93, kind of where you kind of think of as the middle class, you're talking about another 3% there. Now, the realest big savings kick in once you kind of move beyond that middle class. You get 4% as you kind of move up, and then 6 and up. Now, those things we take a look at this, and that can actually help growth. As a matter of fact, one of the other elements here that can be useful, the Section 179 expensing. There's a number of things in this bill, as you look at it carefully, that I think look positive for small businesses, especially in the deduction of costs of equipment purchases, R&D expenses. That's not going to get phased out. Those are things that are helpful. They're helpful economic drivers, though. However, the problem on the policy side for me, Ken, is that the tax side it's overwhelmingly a benefit, not primarily for the economic drivers of the U.S. economy, which is purchasers. They are, again, primarily going to be for those making over, again, I've been looking at this carefully, somewhere in the vicinity of $500,000 a year. That's really where the biggest benefits policy-wise kick in. And so as a result, that's going to mean that it's going to have less growth than is really getting driven here, right? So, Trump has been talking about these policies as maybe increasing growth 10 times. I have taken a look actually at a variety of different tax policy institutes. The Tax Foundation, which is a very pro kind of Republican conservative view, they're still only putting it at somewhere about 2.5% increase to the GDP. Moody's is going to be on the low side at 0.3% of a shift. And what that really indicates to me, when you take a look at earlier kinds of tax cuts, is how untargeted this bill really is for economic growth. Right. So looking at it as a kind of a libertarian dude who really wants to kind of see those things and is pro tax cuts, and I see some of the positives here, it's not going to lead to the size that we're looking at. If you split the difference, we're talking about a 1% increase, and that's going to be totally undone when we start taking a look at the effects of it in terms of its cost, right? And so I looked at a number of the papers on this. I've read the deal itself. Wharton's Business School paper looked specifically just at the Tax Cuts and Job Acts, if they'd just gone forward without anything else, and compared that with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, to kind of give it to see that the deficit is going to raise somewhere in the vicinity of $4 trillion. And that would be a debt increase of 16% by 2054. And so, yes, tax cuts can absolutely stimulate economic growth. And again, philosophically and empirically, it's clear that they can be a good and a moral thing. However, in this particular case, the actual tax cuts, I cannot find, you take a look at the most friendly set of numbers that I can find, and there is no universe in which the economic growth from this bill, which there will be some, but the economic growth from this bill, take a look at the biggest that you can get, is going to undo the nearly $4 trillion in debt and the 16% in debt increase in deficit spending. So how do we get to all of those kinds of items? Well, it goes back to the politics side of things, Ken, that we were talking about. If you take a look at the nitty gritty of the bill, there's going to be a 4-year supplemental funding of ICE by $75 $75 billion. $75 billion. 45 billion of that is for adult and family detention center capacity increases. 10 billion of that is to hire 10,000 more ICE personnel. Meanwhile, defense funding is going to go up another $150 billion. And so again, this is all you're talking about politics. This is not what you do if you want to have, had you had the tax elements of this and left those two items out, you could have seen somewhere in the vicinity of 4 to 5 times the increase in growth as a result of losing the deficit spending. So in other words, if even if you got rid of nothing else, but if you got rid of the ICE and the additional defense spending, this bill would be phenomenally different in terms of its economic output. So how do you balance all of this? Well, the answer is, if you get into the weeds of this, the paying for it comes almost entirely on increasing restrictions on Medicaid and reducing ACA funding and allowing some of the ACA funding to sunset. And on this, I just focus on a few of the biggest change items on the policies, Ken, right? You have the work and community engagement requirements for Medicaid. That's going to require adults aged 19 to 64 on Medicaid platform to perform 80 hours of work or some kind of qualifying activities per month. That in and of itself isn't necessarily, I get the appeal of that on a policy level. The problem becomes in terms of how do you make it work level? And that becomes both a cost that then ends up kicking off more individuals who are in fact working. And that's something we can talk about on the policy side. It would also increase the eligibility checks to every 6 months and increase cost sharing to up to 5% of individuals' income. Now, I recognize that people, again, on paper, that idea of eligibility checks every 6 months sounds phenomenal. But as somebody who's been on both sides of that, I can tell you that even as a college professor, getting all the paperwork together and doing that is very, very difficult. It is very time consuming. And it is panic inducing. I can't tell you, there were several times my wife and I just thought maybe it would be better if we didn't fuss with that, right? And we are both educated individuals. The other huge savings here is going to come from the ACA marketplace changes, which is going to eliminate auto enrollments, meaning you got to keep, again, another reapplying. It's going to shorten the enrollment period. It's going to end those enhanced ACA subsidies, not here. That one will not be the delay. That'll actually happen in the upcoming enrollment cycle for 2026. If you take a look at most medical outlets, it looks somewhere between 16 to 18 million more people are going to be uninsured. And that's going to lead to about 31-ish billion in unreimbursed care for hospitals, which not only means that subsidies are going to go up somewhere in the vicinity of $700 per year for the average family of 4, but because of that 31 billion in unreimbursed care, it probably means non-ACA health plans are going to have to increase in price correspondingly to cover the costs for those individuals without health care now under the ACA. Because, nobody's just going to be eating that 31 billion at those hospitals. It's coming from somewhere, and it's going to be coming from, well, not you personally, but, from listeners. So there's kind of the policy sides of things. What have I missed? What do we need to get into here on this, Ken?
Yeah, I thought that was a great summary. There's just, you beat me to the punch of saying a couple of the things that I was going to say. But one thing you said, and I just want to repeat it, maybe slightly more succinctly, is, you've got a lot of tax cuts and you got a lot of spending cuts, and so in principle those could offset each other, except that in fact, you've got even more spending increases than spending cuts. So there's all this new spending, and exactly as you said, primarily on immigration enforcement and on military spending. But that itself is more new spending than the spending cuts to Medicaid and SNAP and these other programs. And then you've also got these massive tax cuts. So it puts the budget into a structural kind of deficit that is, really a great leap forward in the amount of deficit that's built in every year now. And it just also means that going forward, because of that, an increasing amount of the budget every year is going to have to be allocated to paying interest on all this debt. So it's kind of a downward spiral now. We've always had this problem. Most years we've had a deficit. Many times the deficit has been bigger than in the previous year, although sometimes not bigger than in the previous year. But this is just like massively increasing it to by an order of magnitude compared to previous year, and locking that in for a few years. So I think it digs the hole enough deeper that a lot of bond rating agencies and stuff are downgrading the U.S. bonds now. There's more serious talk than ever about whether the U.S. might actually default on its debt because the debt is getting more uncontrollable. And I know that kind of talk has been around a long time, but it does seem slightly more serious to me now. So you have those problems, and then you do have these policy choices of that the building immigration prisons and having 10,000 more ICE agents is being prioritized over keeping people on healthcare and keeping people eating, with SNAP. And the food has also, other, I think, negative externalities, because it's not just that there's going to be people going hungry, but also that's going to affect agriculture. That's going to affect farmers, right? If they can't sell the food because there's no money, a lot of people don't have money anymore to buy the food, then that affects all those markets. Also, you talked about, from the user side, all these new hoops that people are going to have to jump through to prove that they're working in order to stay on Medicaid. It's not just the user side. That's one thing I'd also add. The states have to pay to run the systems that actually process those claims. And I think Governor Shapiro, at least in Pennsylvania, said that it would cost so much money for Pennsylvania, which has a fairly large population, and a large population on Medicaid, to just administer the process of checking up on everybody every 6 months, making sure they're working, making sure they get all their paperwork in, kicking them off Medicaid if they don't, that the state might not be able to afford to do that. And they might have to levy new state taxes just simply to maintain the ability to keep up with the paperwork for all the Medicaid applicants. And some states are not going to levy new taxes to do that. So that's sort of another problem there. It seems kind of designed to put Medicaid into a downward spiral as well, where it just gets harder and harder for people to use, not only if they're not working, but also even if they are working, which you also said. So yeah, so I see those as kind of the big bad things. The one thing, with all the tax cuts, one thing you didn't mention, but I mean, you knew it, but listeners might not, is that a lot of this is just extensions of the 2017 tax cuts anyhow. So you have this difference between what they call current law and what they call current policy, whereas the current policy would be what were the tax rates in 2024 and 2023 and 2022. But because the 2017 law that cut those rates, sunsets in 2025, that means that under the current law, the rates would have gone back up, but now because of the new law, they won't. But people are not going to actually experience a lot of that as a tax cut. They're just going to experience that as I'm just paying the same taxes I paid last year and the year before and the year before. They'd have to remember all the way back to 2016, if they want to experience it as a tax cut. And I think we were just talking earlier about how people can't think about what's going to happen 6 months in the future. They probably also can't think about what happened 10 years in the past or remember, what tax rate they were paying then. And so I think in that sense, there are some new tax cuts as well, but I think the majority of the tax cuts in this bill are actually just extensions of the 2017 tax cuts. So that's where a lot of the spending's going, and so that would make me question, the growth numbers that you were citing, and I take it that you were conceding that those are going to be outweighed by all the other problems, but even those numbers, I think, are being put in comparison to current law, not in comparison to current policy. Right, we're not going to see even those levels of growth compared to what we actually have now. We're only going to see those levels of growth compared to what we would have had if the old tax rates from 2016 had sprung back into effect.
Now, to be clear, the reporting I was doing there from the Wharton School, that was in fact accounting for that difference. But even that minor increase, again, like I said, is not going to be overcome. But in terms of the politics, or not the politics, but in terms of the voting for it, you're absolutely right. It's not as if we get up here and Republicans are going to feel some kind of bounce as a result of, hey, look, my taxes were theoretically $700 less than they would have been had they not expired, right? Because I didn't pay that $700 last year. So no, you're absolutely right about that. There's no universe in which now, to go back to what you had said earlier, though, I mean, there is a level to which the balance of this is weird, because some of the tax cuts that we didn't talk about are actually on very targeted individuals, one of which might get a bump for Republicans would be the Social Security tax change. Now, I say the tax change because while it was mentioned that the idea was we shouldn't have any more taxes on Social Security benefits, that's not actually what made it into the final version of the bill. It was a $6,000, effectively kind of like a tax credit. But I'm still reading there. I can't tell if it's a true tax credit or if it's a way to lower your deduction overall, because those actually get calculated in different ways. But the short way to take it is now that group will, in fact, experience a difference. So maybe there would be one of the few tax cuts. The other one where you might have a tax cut that people feel is going to be on overtime and on, especially on tips for workers, for service workers. They might experience a huge difference as we get to tax season here next year. So those groups might experience a bigger good feeling for Republicans. But no, otherwise I agree with you. The generalized extension of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is not going to change anybody's opinion, because that's what you've experienced for 10 years.
Yeah, and there's a few other, I think you hit the big ones: tipped income, overtime income, tax on Social Security income. Those are new tax cuts. There's other new tax cuts for people like whaling captains in Alaska who want to buy more expensive harpoons, or for liquor makers.
I am sure that Ahab, as he sails the globe, will be excited about that one. But if you know any whalers there, kid?
Yeah, no, that was one of those ones they did to get Murkowski's vote, and now they can spend up to $100,000 on their harpoons and write that all off. And that is, we laugh about that, but there is an interesting bit of politicking there. I mean, Murkowski was a definitive no vote until she got enough stuff. And then what you say in the hallway, other than, look, I still hate the bill, but it was going to pass, so I got Alaska everything I could. And she actually got Alaska exempted from the Medicaid cuts and the SNAP cuts as well. So Alaska comes out ahead on all this, and they get the harpoon whalers exemption. And there's another exemption for liquor makers who produce rum in Puerto Rico or in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I don't know who that was for the benefit of, probably for the liquor makers themselves rather than for any particular senator or Congress member. But there's a few things like
we
that.
We don't have any from Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, just to be clear for listeners.
Right. But there actually are also some targeted changes that are going to take away tax credits and deductions that other groups were benefiting from. I mentioned the one with Musk earlier, but substantially all the tax credits and tax deductions that were available for, green energy, for wind power, for solar power, for purchasers of electric vehicles, for people who put solar on their houses. A lot of that stuff's going away. So people who would have been able to benefit from those kinds of tax credits, including both consumers and businesses, that a lot of that's going away. There were programs for students, so both the income-driven repayment plan for people who had student loans, or the what they call the PLUS loan, which was mainly for medical students and law students, but people who needed to borrow more than $200,000, they used to be able to borrow up to the cost of their actual tuition. And that seems like an especially cruel one to take away, because there was basically no problem with defaults, in those populations. Like, the government was lending all that money, but doctors and lawyers are paying it back later. So it really wasn't even costing the government anything. But, different kinds of tinkering with the tax code are adversely affecting some groups, but of course, on balance, and this is the point you made, if you make a lot more cuts than increases, then more people are going to benefit from the cuts than be harmed by the increases.
Yeah. Well, Ken, I knew that we weren't going to get to a bunch of things because we're going to get the details of stuff, but we're hitting the hour mark already for this show. Right. Yeah. So I think what we're going to say is, Ken, it's been a lot of fun doing this special 4th of July Independence episode with you.
Yeah, I wish we had a couple more things to talk about, but
we did. But I promise we'll get to them. Some of one of them I think is a little evergreen. We can get there. We want to talk a little bit about some of that citizenship revoking, and some things might continue to percolate from that DOJ memo. But so we have fun things coming for you. I will again be back next week, but next week I'll be here with Justin. But it won't be this amazing freedom fighting 4th of July episode with Trey and Ken. So I just want to say thank you, everybody. If you are listening right now, we really appreciate that. But actually, Ken and I were not finished. It has been a few months because of some of us being off and away. But Ken and I will be getting back to our Constitution show for the midweek exclusive show here in just a few minutes. We are going to be moving into the 23rd Amendment, probably getting into the 24th Amendment. We're getting there towards the end of the Constitution. Once we get done, we've got some special fun announcements about the Constitution's shows that we've done that I'm really excited, but we're holding those close. So if you want to know more about those kind of behind the scene things we're getting ready to do, or if you want to listen to that 23rd Amendment show, which is a lot of fun, deals with why do we have the federal district, you need to become a supporter of the Politics Guys. And if you want to do that, all you got to do is scroll down right there in the show notes, and you're going to see the way you can click right there on it, and you can support the show. It only takes a minute or so. And it's a lot of fun to have you. And then you can have instantaneous access, not only to the 23rd and 24th Amendment that's coming up here in just a few minutes, but you also get access to all of the bonus shows that we do. And that includes, Ken and I have now been doing this for multiple years. We are, all through every portion of the United States Constitution. We'd love for you to head back and take a look at all of those interesting cases and the history and the details and the politics of the Constitution. But to do that, you got to become a member of the Politics Guys. So again, head down there to the show notes, click on that, or if you want to do it on your browser of your choice, head to politicsguys.com/support. Don't forget, you can always email us at mail@politicsguys.com or hit us up on social media, again, in the show notes. It's always helpful if you will subscribe, rate, or review. We need those algorithms. We need AI. Please do that. We would deeply, deeply appreciate it. And I also want to give a phenomenal shout out to all of the amazing executive producers of the Politics Guys. I love that I have so many to read, and I appreciate each and every one of you a ton because you make this show possible. And they are Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. We'll be back with a new full episode next weekend. Happy July 4th.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,